From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. The Sunday Times US correspondent, Louise Callaghan, was preparing for her latest reporting trip when she came across a video online.
So the video shows Dr. Adelaida Martinez Parcero, who's from the town of Tila in southern Mexico. She's standing on the street.
The woman has a handbag crossed over her body, and she's wearing dark red trousers. Her white vest is drenched in an even brighter red.
She's covered in blood. She's screaming. Today they took my father and many friends away from me. You asked you for justice, but you didn't listen to us. Justicia hoy más que nunca. Y si esto empeora será su culpa. And so that video was taken moments after her father died in her arms. He'd been killed by a local militia who'd been in conflict with their family.
Horrifying, violent tragedies like this are not unusual in this small town in the state of Chiapas, near the border of Guatemala. For the people of Tila, their home has been torn apart by a deadly battle between two of the world's most powerful and dangerous cartels.
The thing is, Chiapas looks remote, but in reality, it's right on the route where drugs and migrants flow north from Central and South America into the US. And that is some of the most lucrative trafficking routes in the world. They are also routes which it is the absolute number one priority of the US president to try and cut off. So even though this area might look remote, this conflict might seem, kind of niche. It's a conflict about land rights in a mountaintop town in southern Mexico. This has global consequences.
Drug traffickers have exploited a decades-old dispute about indigenous land rights and have used it to wreak havoc on this town. But the government has turned a blind eye. The story today, the town ripped apart by Mexico's new Narcos.
My name's Louise Callaghan, and I'm the US correspondent for the Sunday Times. And I just spent a few weeks in Chiapas in Mexico, writing about a battle between cartels and their proxies there, which is destabilizing the region.
Louise, tell us about Tila, a town that you visited. How did you get there, and what sort of a place is it?
So Tila is this quite remote town in the southern state of Chiapas, which is this state of Mexico that borders Guatemala. And it's a very, very poor region. So it's the poorest state in Mexico. About 70% of the people there live in poverty. And Tila is this kind of mountaintop town. You have to drive for hours through the mountains, through the forests to get there. It's kind of up almost above the cloud line. And it's this very kind of quaint Spanish colonial town. It's beautiful, the food's amazing. But it's also incredibly strategically important because it runs on these routes which run from the south, from Guatemala, north to the US, where cartels smuggle drugs, migrants, guns, and where they also battle for control of these routes, because when you control these routes, then you can make huge, huge amounts of money.
What took you there?
So there's been this decades-long struggle over land rights in Tila between two of the groups that live there, indigenous people and people who are settled in the town. But in recent years then, this conflict has become about something much more than land rights. And that's because two of the biggest cartels in Mexico, the Jalisco Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel, have been battling over turf in the area. So they both want to control Tila, they both want to control Chiapas, the wider region. And that's led to this upsurge in violence there.
And when you say an upsurge in violence, I mean, do you have any figures on how many people have been killed recently?
So the figures vary pretty wildly, but civil society organisations that we spoke to in Tila told us that in just a few days last year, when there was an outbreak in violence, when two groups started fighting each other in Tila, then 42 people were killed. I mean, this is a fairly small town. 42 people is a really large number. There's about 4,000 people who were displaced from Tila just in those few days. That was the biggest displacement in Mexico for 3 years.
How representative is that of the rest of the country? I mean, what is the violence like across Mexico right now, and how strong are the cartels?
So since 2018, about 30,000 people have been killed every year in Mexico due to these kind of violent attacks. And that's from organised crime groups, like the cartels, and that's, it's also from criminal gangs. And at the moment then, 14 of Mexico's 32 states have been affected by violence in the last year. And, of this kind of cartel-linked violence. I cannot overstate how much this is. You kind of think of a war between organised criminal groups, and you might think of it almost like an insurgency.
Yeah.
But this is a proper war. They have heavy weaponry. And then so all of this has this devastating effect on civilians. So there are over 100,000 people who are registered disappeared in Mexico. And that's an undercount. Loads of people don't register when their loved ones go missing because they're worried about blowback.
I mean, that's an extraordinary number, and this is a very serious war. If you were trying to explain the situation in Tila in particular to people, how would you begin? Because I guess to understand the current situation, you probably have to go back about 90 years.
Exactly, yeah. So in 1934, then indigenous farmers here in the area claimed that the government had stolen 130 acres of their land and then sold them to the people who were living in the town. So there's been this kind of ongoing struggle about land rights, and these indigenous farmers, they've been fighting to get their land back. So that's the land that today comprises the town of Tila. They went all the way to Mexico's Supreme Court. There's been rulings in their favour. There's been rulings against them. None of it's really been implemented. It's basically unresolved. And then so that anger and resentment is growing and it's festering. The land itself is important to these people, to the farmers who've now formed this militia. But it's also that you can make a lot of money from the land in this town, because Tila is very famous for its religious pilgrimages. There's the Cristo de Tila, which is their kind of local saint, is worshipped particularly by the Mayan people who live in the area. And the townspeople, the pobladores, they are profiting. I mean, they're the ones who earn money from the pilgrimages when people come there, because they own shops in the town and things like that. So some of the indigenous farmers who have been sort of relegated to the outskirts of town, they think that this is their land and that they should be allowed a claim to it.
Hoy estamos acá, compañeros.
Today, we are here, comrades, to defend our homeland, where our children, our sons and grandparents eat. That's why we defend the land, comrades.
Por eso defendemos la tierra, compañeros. ¿No es así?
After a long struggle, in around 2010, they negotiated this peace with the government. It was still very unstable. They have more autonomy. They have these kind of communal land agreements, autonomous areas. But at the same time, it's never quite been stable. And all of these resentments and all of these divisions over land rights still remain.
So they negotiate a temporary peace, but nothing is quite resolved. At what point do the drug cartels plough in? So
it's been, I think, fair to say decades now that the Sinaloa cartel has dominated Chiapas. The Sinaloa cartel is one of the biggest, most dangerous and most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world. And it used to be led by Joaquin Guzman, known as El Chapo, who is at the moment serving life imprisonment in the US. This cartel, the Sinaloa cartel, controlled the routes through Mexico of drugs through Chiapas for a really long time.
This propaganda video published last year by the Sinaloa cartel shows what appears to be a cartel parade, where local residents were reportedly forced to cheer on passing vehicles.
Then about 5 years ago, the Jalisco Cartel, which is one of its rivals, started pushing up. So the Jalisco Cartel sort of had power in parts of Guatemala, which is right to the south of Chiapas. And they started kind of pushing up to expand their reach in Chiapas.
A viral video featuring a tangle of bloodied bodies lying in a dump truck is making rounds in Mexico. Officials say these are the victims of a gunfight between Guatemala's Jalisco gang and Mexico's powerful Sinaloa cartel.
And so they're both really powerful cartels, and they're now embroiled, for the last few years, they've been embroiled in a kind of low-grade turf war to control routes which go through Chiapas up to the north to the US. And that is why they are so lucrative, and these routes are so important, is because they are the ways that you can supply cocaine to the Americans.
So you suddenly have two of the world's most dangerous cartels moving into this little mountainous area. In Tila, they end up taking advantage of the divides that already exist. Just explain how that happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this 90-year-old battle over land rights, it's essentially divided between indigenous farmers who tend to live on the outskirts of town, and then the townspeople in Tila itself. And then when the cartels started battling for the area, then they essentially turned these two groups into proxies. And they funneled their weapons, their support into these two groups, one on each side, in order to stoke the conflict, in order to battle for control over these areas. So on one side, we have the indigenous farmers who'd formed a militia called Los Autónomos. And people in the area told us, and experts told us, were backed by the Sinaloa cartel. And then on the other side, we have a group which is allegedly backed by some of the townspeople who call themselves Grupo Karma. And their people told us backed by the Jalisco cartel. So they've latched onto this kind of century-old conflict between these two groups and using them as proxies and funneling arms and support into them so that they can battle for control of Tila, and through that, once one group controls Tila, then the cartels can shift their product through it. They can sell drugs there, and they can traffic migrants through the area.
And do the local groups admit that they have backing?
Well, no, they don't. They say that are just fighting for their own local struggle, but they accuse the other ones of being backed by the cartels. So each side says that their war is the just one and that the other side are just a proxy of a cartel.
Louise, the arrival of this new cartel 5 years ago, the Jalisco cartel, takes us back to where we began with that awful scene, the video you watched, of Dr. Adelaida Martinez Parcero. You went to meet her. Just tell us a bit about her.
So I'd read about Dr. Adelaida online because she's named in a bunch of local media reports as being a member of Grupo Karma. And she agreed to meet us in a cafe in a town in Chiapas.
¿Puede presentarse como un poquito cuál es su nombre, su trabajo, de dónde eres, todo eso? Mi nombre es Adelaida Cruz de Santi Martínez Parcero. Soy originaria.
We went to meet her, and I immediately was so struck by her confidence. Most people were so afraid of speaking on camera to us, but she was happy to talk, I think, pretty openly on camera.
Soy médico general de profesión.
She's a doctor. She now, since a few years ago, has been living outside the town in a secret location because she doesn't want people to know where she is, for her own safety.
Trabajé 18 años en mi pueblo.
I lived in my town for 18 years, but because of the situation that started there, the violence started to increase and focus on my family. Therefore, since 2021, I've been in different places.
Her family is very prominent within these townspeople, so the ones who've been fighting with the indigenous farmers. Her family's been engaged with conflict with them for a long time.
This is the list of the murders that have been committed since 2016.
She told me that she knew personally, as in, her kind of friends and family, 17 people who'd been killed in the last few years. I mean, given that it's a town of probably about 6,000 people, it's remarkable. So her father was killed 5 years ago, and he was shot on the street, and she blames Los Autónomos, this indigenous militia. And she tried to save him, but he died in her arms.
My dad, he bled to death in my arms. I saw the magnitude of his injury and said no. I knew I was going to lose him. I knew I was going to lose him.
Soon after her brother was killed, then her cousin was killed. And so she's been accused repeatedly in local media of being a member of Grupo Karma, this militia which is fighting Los Autónomos. And she told us she wasn't.
The authorities at all levels of government are responsible for this, because we knocked on the door many times and told them this could happen at any moment if they didn't take action.
And she was furious. I mean, she was incredibly, incredibly angry at the local government for not stopping the violence.
My dad said they told us to go to hell because they didn't pay attention to us. And days later, my dad was killed in the street in 2020.
And she was not, calling for peace. She was vowing retribution on these people who'd killed so many members of her family.
Why has she been accused of being part of Grupo Karma? Is there a sense that everybody in Tila is on one side or the other?
So many civilians told us that all they wanted was peace and that they just wanted the fighting to stop. But the way the two groups see it, they see it as you're either for us or against us. It's a very kind of black and white way of viewing things. So it's really difficult to say why it is in particular that Adelaida, who's generally known as La Doctora, why she's been accused so much of being a member of Grupo Karma. I think it's because her family was so associated with them. And whether that's fair or not, we don't have any proof either way, whether her family has been involved in any of the attacks on Los Autónomos, then she certainly denies it. And she says that her family has been unjustly accused of being members of these cartels. But more than anything, I think she blames the local government for not doing enough to stop the killing.
Tell us more about the more recent attacks. Last summer, I understand Tila erupted into violence. What actually happened?
Yeah, so it started on June the 4th last year, and we spoke to some civilians who gave us eyewitness accounts of what happened. They told us that in the evening, around midnight, men started gathering on the streets holding machetes. And soon there was automatic gunfire sounding through the streets. People were hiding inside their homes. People told us about, hiding their kids in wardrobes or under the beds because they were so afraid that the cartels were going to come in. These two militias, Los Autónomos and Grupo Karma, were battling it out on the streets. And videos from the time show that there were these really heavily armed men, people carrying assault rifles, they're masked, they're driving around town in pickups, they're hunting for people to assassinate.
I had cameras in my house. They destroyed them all. They burned my neighbour's house down. First they fired at their houses, and then they burned 3 houses. Suddenly there was no noise, there was nothing. Even the birds fled. It was a terrible night, a terrible dawn.
And you can see in photos from the time that there are bodies slumped on the road, they've been executed. Houses burnt down. When we were in Tila, we could see the remnants of the houses that had been burnt down. There were bullet holes in houses and shops around the town. It was a complete disaster. 4 days before the army came, the town was on complete lockdown as this war continued in the streets.
It sounds absolutely horrific. And that idea of these militias driving around looking for people to assassinate. I mean, who were they after? And just tell us some of the stories you heard of the people who got caught up in it.
They appear to have been hunting for specific people who they associated with being part of the rival groups. But they were clearly not above targeting families or, women or children. So one man told us that he'd been away from the town on the first day, but managed to make it back in. And he came back and he found his wife. She was hiding inside the house.
I found my family surrounded. They had threatened them with a weapon.
She'd been hiding in a room and she'd heard them saying, "Let's kill the woman, let's kill the woman," talking about her.
And my children were terrified, completely terrified.
And she was hiding with the kids, and amazingly, they hadn't found her.
How did the government respond to this outbreak of violence?
So for decades, then the government has basically been ignoring the situation in Chiapas, and this was no exception. So after these 4 days of horrifying fighting, then the president at the time, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he said that this was just a local conflict that was basically best left ignored.
Esto que está sucediendo en Tila es muy lamentable.
He said what's happening in Tila is very regrettable, but it's not a fight against the oppressive state apparatus.
El aparato del Estado opresor.
No, it's a confrontation between the people themselves.
No, es una confrontación entre el mismo pueblo.
So he very much called it this kind of local conflict with no wider significance.
Wow. A conflict between the people themselves, which is killing more than 40 people, not something he needs to worry about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's very much of a piece with how the government has been treating the situation here. I mean, this is a poor state. There's many indigenous people there. The conflict is really complicated. It's really just seen as a headache by successive national governments. And then, of course, there's a really important point that lots of, according to documents leaked by hackers from the Mexican army, then it's clear that police and local officials have accepted bribes and colluded with cartels to traffic drugs and migrants throughout the country. That's the other thing. So there's seen by the national government as a headache, but also clearly then local officials and police have been involved in this corruption and have colluded with cartels.
Do you think any of that will change? Do you think the government will have to do something about it, partly because of the threat of Trump?
So since Trump came to power, then the crackdown on the cartels has intensified. So both the Jalisco Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel were designated as foreign terrorist organizations by the US. Just after Trump's inauguration, that was one of his first acts. President Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico is absolutely in this incredibly difficult situation. It's the high wire balancing act of her life. She's trying to keep Trump from destroying her country's economy with tariffs. Sheinbaum has said that she's sent 10,000 troops to the border. I'm not sure if she actually has, but there definitely has been a start of trying to close the border down much more. There have been some major fentanyl seizures in the last few months, and the Mexican government claims that less fentanyl is crossing the border now. One really important development was that Sheinbaum handed over 29 quite prominent cartel members to the US, because that's always been a real sticking point, that the Mexican government has often refused to extradite cartel leaders to the US, and the US has said that they're protecting them.
And Louise, Donald Trump, when he came in, classified the cartels as terrorist groups. Does that mean, could we see American intervention on the ground? Could you have special troops turning up in bits of Mexico to take on the cartels themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's what Trump's been talking about. This came up in his first administration. And then it was this very niche idea, sir, are we really going to invade Mexico? No, it sounds completely crazy. But no, it's definitely gained a lot of traction recently. And this is something that they're talking about really seriously now. The US has launched a huge number of drone flights, surveillance flights over Mexican territory. I know that cartel leaders are very, very worried. They think that they could be hit with drone strikes. However, the US wants to spin it, whether you want to call it a limited military incursion or whatever. Sheinbaum told me last year that she would never allow this to happen, that she would consider it an attack on Mexico, an invasion of their sovereignty. Cards are on the table. This is not a niche idea anymore as it was 8 years ago. This is something that really powerful people within the Trump administration want is something that possibly Trump wants.
Some of these cartels, the Sinaloa cartel in particular, have been around for decades. You know, as you say, there's clearly a lot of corruption with local politicians, with bits of the army. Is it a problem you can even tackle in Mexico if you happen to be the government?
Well, successive presidents in Mexico have tried different strategies to battle the cartels. And some have gone to war, and that's gone terribly for everyone. You know, there's been huge killing, there's been mass displacement, huge instability. Others have sort of essentially colluded with the cartels, tried to create peace in a way while letting them act as a state within the state. That also hasn't worked. Sheinbaum has said that her plan was essentially neither to go to war nor to collude with them, but that she wanted to try and strengthen institutions in Mexico so that people could try and seek justice, for example, when their relatives are disappeared, or to try and end low-level corruption and things like that, to try and strengthen Mexican institutions so that the cartels wouldn't be able to thrive in the vacuum. But I think now there's so much pressure on her government from the US. You know, this threat of tariffs, it could ruin the Mexican economy. There's the threat of drone strikes, the threat of invasion from the US. This is just an incredibly, incredibly difficult moment for Mexico. And I think in this battle with the cartels, the battle to essentially regain control of the country, there are no easy answers.
That was Louise Callaghan, US correspondent at the Sunday Times. You can read Louise's full dispatch from Tila at thetimes.com with a subscription. She also spoke to us a couple of weeks ago from the southern border on how President Trump's immigration policy is playing out. We'll put a link to that report in the episode notes. The producer today was Sam Chantarasak, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if there's a story you think we should be covering, or if you want to get in touch with us about anything else, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.